Have you ever wondered what it feels like to command an empire? Not the glory part, not the victories or the crowns. I mean the actual weight of it. The moment when you realize that every decision you make will echo through history, and you can't take any of it back. Tonight, I want to tell you about a man who understood that weight better than almost anyone who ever lived. And the strange thing is, his greatest strength wasn't his brilliant tactics or his legendary charisma. It was something much simpler. Something we rarely talk about. But before we get there, let me ask you something. If you had the power to change the world, would you really think about it? Because changing the world means carrying it. And that's a different thing entirely. The war was over, but victory had not yet arrived. Napoleon sat alone in his tent. Maps covered the table. A candle had burned halfway down, wax pooling at its base. Outside, his soldiers slept in the cold, exhausted from another day of marching. Inside, the fate of Europe remained awake. This is where most people get Napoleon wrong. They think of him as a conqueror, a military genius, a man drunk on power. And sure, he was all of those things. But that's not what made him different. What made Napoleon different was this: he understood that his greatest enemy wasn't England. It wasn't Russia or Austria or Prussia. His greatest enemy was time. Let me take you back further. To understand why Napoleon walked with his army, you need to understand where he came from. Born in Corsica in 1769, a small island that had just been sold to France by the Republic of Genoa. His family was minor nobility, which meant they had a title but not much money. Napoleon grew up speaking Italian, not French. He was short, awkward, and his French classmates mocked his accent. He was an outsider from the beginning. But here's what matters. That experience of being an outsider, of being looked down upon, of having to prove yourself every single day, it shapes you. It creates a hunger that never goes away. Napoleon didn't just want to succeed. He needed to. And that need drove him to places most men would never dare to go. By the age of 26, he was a general. By 30, he was first consul of France. By 35, he was emperor. That's an insane trajectory. But it came with a price. The higher he climbed, the more alone he became. Power has a way of isolating people. Everyone around you becomes either a follower or a threat. There is no middle ground. So picture this. It's 1805. Napoleon is at the height of his power. He's just crowned himself Emperor of France in Notre Dame, taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head. A statement. A message to all of Europe. I answer to no one. His armies are the best in the world. His tactics are studied and feared. Kings and emperors tremble at the mention of his name. He should feel invincible. But he doesn't, because Napoleon knows something that his enemies don't understand yet. Empires aren't built on battlefields. They're built in the minds of the people who serve them. An army is only as strong as its belief in its commander. And belief is a fragile thing. This is why he walked. Every morning, Napoleon would leave his tent before dawn. He would walk through the camps, past sleeping soldiers, past dying fires, past horses tied to posts. He would check supplies, inspect weapons, talk to officers. But more importantly, he would let himself be seen. Not riding on a white horse like some distant god. Walking. In the mud. In the cold. In the same conditions as the lowest private. Do you see what he was doing? He was making himself human. Accessible. Real. When a soldier saw Napoleon trudging through the same mud he was trudging through, something happened in that soldier's mind. It wasn't just that the emperor cared. It was that the emperor understood. There's a difference. Caring can be performative. Understanding requires shared experience. There's a story from the campaign in Italy. Napoleon's army was crossing the Alps, dragging cannons up mountain passes that most people said were impossible to cross. The men were exhausted, frozen, ready to give up. Napoleon could have stayed in the rear, warm and safe. Instead, he walked at the front of the column. When soldiers saw him, covered in snow, pushing a cannon wheel alongside them, they found the strength to keep going. Not because he ordered them to, because he showed them it could be done. Leadership isn't about giving orders from a distance. It's about showing people what's possible. And you can't do that from a throne. But here's where it gets complicated. Because Napoleon wasn't just being strategic. He wasn't just manipulating his troops into loyalty. There was something else going on. Something deeper. Napoleon needed to walk with his army because staying still terrified him. Let me explain. When you're moving, when you're marching, when you're planning the next battle and the next campaign, you don't have time to think about the bigger questions. Questions like, what am I really doing? Is this worth it? What happens when I finally stop? Movement is a kind of escape. From doubt. From fear. From yourself. Napoleon was running from something. Not from his enemies. From his past. From the memory of being that poor Corsican boy who didn't belong. From the fear that maybe he still didn't belong. That maybe all of this, the empire and the glory and the crown, was just a house of cards waiting to collapse. And if he stopped moving, if he stood still for too long, he might have to face that fear. You know that feeling, don't you, when you're so busy that you don't have time to think about whether you're happy? When you fill every moment with activity because silence is uncomfortable. Napoleon lived that feeling on a scale most of us can't imagine. His entire empire was built on motion. The moment he stopped, it would all fall apart. And that's exactly what happened. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about Russia. The year is 1812. Napoleon has conquered most of Europe. Spain, Italy, Austria, Prussia, all either defeated or allied with him. Only Britain and Russia remain outside his control. And Russia is a problem. Tsar Alexander has been making moves, breaking treaties, threatening France's eastern borders. Napoleon decides he has to deal with it. He has to invade Russia. Everyone tells him it's a mistake. His advisors warn him. His generals express concern. Even his wife tries to talk him out of it. But Napoleon doesn't listen. Why? Because stopping isn't an option. Remember, his greatest enemy is time. If he waits, if he hesitates, his enemies will grow stronger. His allies will lose faith. The empire will crack. He has to keep moving forward. Always forward. So in June of 1812, Napoleon leads the largest army ever assembled into Russia. 680,000 men. That's more than the population of most cities at the time. It's an unstoppable force. Or so everyone thinks. But here's what Napoleon didn't account for. Russia is huge. Unimaginably huge. The Russian army retreats, burning everything behind them. Towns, crops, supplies, everything. Napoleon's army marches deeper and deeper into Russia, chasing an enemy that won't fight. And every day, the supply lines get longer. Every day, more soldiers fall behind. Every day, the army gets weaker, and Napoleon walks with them. Every step of the way, through the dust and the heat of summer, through the mud of autumn, through the beginning of the Russian winter, he walks with his army because that's who he is. That's what he does. He can't stop. Even when it becomes clear that this campaign is a disaster, that they're marching into oblivion, he keeps walking. They reach Moscow in September. The city is empty. The Russians have abandoned it. And then, that night, fires start. The Russians have set their own capital on fire rather than let Napoleon have it. He stands in the Kremlin, watching the city burn, and for maybe the first time in his life, he doesn't know what to do. There's no one to negotiate with. No supplies to capture. No victory to claim. Just a burning city and winter approaching. He waits for 5 weeks, hoping the Tsar will surrender. But the Tsar doesn't come. And Napoleon realizes he's made a terrible mistake. He's marched 600,000 men into a trap. And now he has to get them out. The retreat from Moscow is one of the most horrific military disasters in history. Winter hits early and hard. Temperatures drop to 30 below zero. Soldiers freeze to death while marching. Horses collapse and are eaten. The Russian army and Cossack raiders attack constantly. Men die from cold, from hunger, from disease, from enemy fire. They die by the thousands every day. And Napoleon walks with them. Not at the front anymore, not inspiring anyone. Just trudging through the snow with the survivors, trying to make it back to Poland, to safety, to anything resembling civilization. Out of 680,000 men who entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 make it out. It's a catastrophe on a scale that's hard to comprehend. But here's the thing. Even in defeat, even in disaster, Napoleon's soldiers still follow him. Because he's there with them. Suffering with them. Not safe in Paris, not warm in some castle. Walking in the snow, hungry and cold like everyone else. That bond, that shared experience of suffering, creates a loyalty that survives even the worst defeat. When Napoleon finally makes it back to Paris, his empire is cracking. His enemies sense weakness. The coalition against him grows stronger. But Napoleon doesn't stop. He raises another army. And another. He keeps fighting, keeps moving, keeps pushing forward. Because stopping means facing the truth. That he's lost. That it's over. That time has finally caught up with him. In 1814, the combined armies of Europe invade France. Napoleon fights brilliantly, winning battle after battle against overwhelming odds. But there are too many enemies and not enough soldiers. His marshals, the men who have followed him for years, finally tell him it's over. They won't fight anymore. And Napoleon, for the first time in his life, stops. He abdicates. Gives up the throne. They exile him to Elba, a tiny island off the coast of Italy. It should be the end of the story, but it's not. Because Napoleon can't stop. After less than a year, he escapes from Elba. He lands in France with a handful of loyal soldiers. And then something extraordinary happens. The French army, sent to arrest him, joins him instead. As Napoleon walks north toward Paris, more and more soldiers abandon their posts and march with him. King Louis XVIII flees. Napoleon enters Paris without firing a shot and reclaims the throne. All because men remember what it was like to serve under a leader who walked with them. But this resurrection lasts only 100 days. the European powers assemble another coalition. They meet Napoleon at a place called Waterloo in Belgium. It's June 18th, 1815. One last battle. One last chance. Napoleon almost wins. For hours, the outcome hangs in the balance. But then the Prussian army arrives to reinforce the British. Napoleon's army breaks. He loses. This time, there's no mercy. They exile him to St. Helena, a remote island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. About as far from Europe as you can get while still being on Earth. And there, finally, Napoleon stops walking. He has nowhere left to go. No army to command. No empire to build. Just a small house on a windswept island, with British guards watching to make sure he never leaves. He spends 6 years there. 6 years of stillness after a lifetime of motion. And you know what he does? He writes. He dictates his memoirs to anyone who will listen. He rewrites history, shapes his legacy, tries to control how the world will remember him. Because that's all he has left. The story. Napoleon dies on May 5th, 1821. He's 51 years old. Some say it was stomach cancer. Others say it was poisoning. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that he finally stopped. And in that stopping, in that silence, maybe he finally had to face what he'd been running from all along. So what was he running from? I think it was the fear that he wasn't enough. That the empire and the glory and the crown were all just ways to prove to himself and to the world that the poor boy from Corsica mattered. That he was worthy. That he belonged. But here's the tragedy. No amount of conquest could ever fill that void. No victory could ever be enough. Because the thing he was running from was inside him. An emperor grows not when he conquers his enemies, but when he conquers his doubts. And Napoleon never conquered his doubts. He just outran them for as long as he could. Let me ask you something. Why do we remember Napoleon? Not because he won a lot of battles, though he did. Not because he was Emperor of France, though he was. We remember him because he represents something fundamental about human nature. The drive to prove yourself. The refusal to accept limitations. The belief that if you just keep moving, if you just keep fighting, you can overcome anything. But we also remember him as a cautionary tale. Because that same drive, that refusal to stop, ultimately destroyed him. There is a balance to be found between ambition and wisdom. Between striving and accepting. Napoleon never found that balance. He was all motion, no rest. All ambition, no peace. And that brings us back to why he walked with his army. On the surface, it was tactical. It built loyalty, created bonds, made him effective as a leader. But deeper down, it was personal. It was about refusing to be separate from his soldiers because being separate meant being alone. And being alone meant facing himself. And facing himself meant confronting the fear that maybe, despite everything he'd accomplished, he still wasn't enough. Do you see the tragedy in that? Here's a man who conquered most of Europe, who redrew the map, who changed history, who is still studied and discussed 200 years after his death. And yet, he spent his entire life feeling like he had something to prove. He never felt like he'd done enough. Never felt like he'd arrived. He was always chasing the next victory, the next campaign, the next proof of his worth. There's a lesson in that. Maybe several lessons. First, that external achievement can't fix internal doubt. Napoleon conquered nations but couldn't conquer his own insecurity. Second, that movement isn't always progress. Sometimes you're just running in place, exhausting yourself without actually getting anywhere. Third, that leadership requires presence, but presence requires peace. And peace requires the courage to stop and face yourself. Napoleon never had that courage. Or maybe he did, and that's why he kept moving. Maybe he knew exactly what he'd find if he stopped, and he chose motion over truth. In a way, that's even more tragic. To know you're running from yourself and to choose to keep running anyway. But here's something else to consider. Maybe Napoleon's greatest achievement wasn't his military genius or his legal reforms or his empire. Maybe it was showing us what happens when you take ambition to its absolute limit. He pushed further than almost anyone in history. And by doing so, he showed us both the power and the cost of that kind of drive. Some people change the world deliberately. They see a problem and fix it. They envision a better future and build it. But Napoleon didn't change the world to make it better. He changed it to prove he could. He changed it because staying still meant confronting the boy he used to be, the outsider, the one who didn't belong. And he couldn't face that boy. So he became an emperor instead. Think about that for a moment. The little decisions we make to avoid pain often have enormous consequences. Napoleon's refusal to confront his insecurity led him to conquer Europe. Your decisions might not have that scale, but the pattern is the same. We're all running from something. The question is whether we have the courage to stop running and turn around. In Napoleon's tent, on those nights after battles, when the maps were rolled up and the candle was burning low, I wonder if he ever thought about stopping. If he ever considered that maybe enough was enough. That maybe he'd proven whatever he needed to prove. That maybe it was okay to rest. I doubt it. Because men like Napoleon don't think that way. Rest feels like weakness. Stopping feels like surrender. And surrender is the one thing they can't do. There's a quote attributed to Napoleon, though like many quotes, its authenticity is debated. He supposedly said, "I am driven towards an end that I do not know. As soon as I reach it, as soon as I become unnecessary, an atom will suffice to shatter me." Read that again. He knew. He knew he was driven by something he didn't understand. He knew that his entire existence depended on being needed, on being in motion. He knew that the moment he stopped being useful, being necessary, being important, he would collapse. And that's exactly what happened. When he was exiled to St. Helena, when he was no longer necessary, when he had no empire to rule and no army to command, he withered. He gained weight. He lost energy. He became a shadow of himself. Because his entire identity was built on motion, and now he was still. Maybe that's why he walked with his army. Not just to build loyalty or to be seen or to inspire his troops. Maybe he walked because stopping meant ceasing to exist. As long as he was moving, as long as he was marching, as long as there was another horizon to chase, he was alive. He was real. He mattered. But what does it mean to matter? Napoleon affected millions of lives. He redrew borders, overthrew kings, created laws that still exist today. By any objective measure, he mattered enormously. And yet, did he ever feel like he mattered? Did he ever look at everything he'd accomplished and feel satisfied? I don't think he did. I think he died still feeling like he had something to prove. That's the real tragedy. Not the exile or the defeats or the wars. The tragedy is that he spent his entire life trying to earn something he already had. Worth. Significance. The right to exist as himself, not as an emperor or a general or a legend, but as a human being. He never gave himself permission to be enough as he was. So he kept trying to become more, and more, and more, until there was nothing left to become. Now, I'm not saying Napoleon was a sympathetic figure. He caused the deaths of millions. His ambition destabilized Europe for decades. His ego was monumental. But understanding why someone does something doesn't mean excusing it. It means recognizing the human behind the history. And the human behind Napoleon was scared. Scared of being forgotten. Scared of being irrelevant. Scared of being that outsider again. So he walked with his army through Italy and Egypt and Austria and Prussia and Poland and Russia. Through victory and defeat. Through summer heat and winter cold. Through mud and dust and blood. He walked because walking meant he was still in control. Still relevant. Still necessary. The moment he stopped walking, the moment he stood still, was the moment he'd have to admit that maybe, just maybe, he'd been chasing something that didn't exist. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you all this. Why does it matter that Napoleon walked with his army? Why should you care about a French emperor who died 200 years ago? Here's why. Because Napoleon's story is everyone's story, just on a larger scale. We're all walking towards something. We're all trying to prove something. We're all running from something. The details differ, but the pattern is the same. The question is whether we're brave enough to stop and ask ourselves what we're really chasing. Are we pursuing goals because they're meaningful, or because we're afraid of what happens if we stop pursuing them? Are we building something worthwhile, or are we just staying busy to avoid being alone with our thoughts? Are we walking towards something, or are we just walking away from ourselves? Napoleon never answered those questions. He never stopped long enough to ask them. He died on a remote island, thousands of miles from the empire he built, surrounded by a handful of loyal followers, still dictating his version of history, still trying to control the narrative, still trying to prove he mattered. He never found peace because he never stopped moving long enough to find it. But you can. You can stop. You can ask yourself the hard questions. You can decide whether the thing you're chasing is worth the chase. You can give yourself permission to be enough as you are, without conquering Europe or building an empire or proving anything to anyone. That's a freedom Napoleon never had. Or rather, it's a freedom he never gave himself. So the next time you feel driven to achieve something, to prove something, to become something, ask yourself why. Is it because you genuinely want it, or is it because you're afraid of what happens if you stop? There's no wrong answer. But there is an honest answer. And finding that honest answer requires the courage to stand still, to stop walking, to face yourself. Napoleon didn't do it. Maybe you can. Here's what I want you to remember from all this. Napoleon wasn't great because he conquered Europe. Lots of people have conquered lots of things. Napoleon was great because he showed us the limits of conquest. He proved that no amount of external success can compensate for internal peace. He demonstrated that you can change the world and still feel empty. He walked with his army for thousands of miles, and in the end, he was still alone. Some men change the world to make it better. Some men change the world because they're trying to change themselves. Napoleon was the second kind. And in that sense, he failed. The world changed, but he didn't. He died the same insecure boy from Corsica he'd always been, just wearing fancier clothes and carrying more regrets. But maybe that's okay. Maybe failure is part of the story. Maybe we're supposed to chase impossible things and fall short. Maybe the point isn't to actually catch what we're chasing. Maybe the point is to understand why we're chasing it. And in understanding that, to learn something about ourselves. Napoleon walked with his army because he was searching for something. He never found it. But perhaps, in watching him search, in seeing him fail, we can avoid making the same mistakes. We can stop running. We can turn around. We can face whatever it is we're afraid of. And in doing so, we can find the peace that eluded him. The war was over, but victory had not yet arrived. That sentence isn't just about Napoleon. It's about all of us. We're all fighting wars, internal or external. And we're all waiting for victory, for the moment when we can finally rest and feel satisfied. But what if victory never arrives? What if the war never really ends? What if we're supposed to find peace during the march, not after it? Napoleon never learned that lesson. He kept walking, kept fighting, kept pushing, right up until the moment he couldn't anymore. And then he was exiled to an island where he couldn't walk anywhere, where there was nowhere left to go. And he realized, too late, that the thing he'd been searching for wasn't at the end of the march. It was with him the whole time. He just never stopped to look for it. Don't make that mistake. Stop. Look around. Ask yourself what you're really doing and why you're really doing it. The answer might surprise you. It might even set you free. Because in the end, we're all just walking. The question is whether we're walking towards something meaningful or away from something painful. Napoleon never figured out the difference. Maybe you will. Some men change the world. Others fight to keep it from changing. Napoleon was both. He revolutionized warfare and law and government. But he was also desperately trying to hold on to a version of himself that had never really existed. The confident emperor was always just a mask worn by the insecure boy. And the mask got heavier every year he wore it. So he walked, and walked, and walked, until there was nowhere left to walk. And then, finally, he had to stop. And in that stopping, in that silence, maybe he finally saw himself clearly. Maybe he finally understood what he'd been running from. Or maybe he died still not knowing. Still wondering. Still chasing. We'll never know. Because Napoleon's real story, the one happening inside his head, died with him on that island. All we have left are the external facts. The battles, the victories, the defeats, the exile. But the internal journey, the real journey, remains a mystery. And maybe that's fitting. Because each of us has to walk our own path. Each of us has to face our own doubts. Each of us has to decide whether we're brave enough to stop running and start living. Napoleon made his choice. Now you get to make yours. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about this. What are you walking toward? What are you walking away from? And what would happen if you stopped walking and stood still for a moment? You might be surprised by what you find. Napoleon conquered an empire but never conquered himself. Don't let that be your story. You have something he never had. You have the gift of his example. You can learn from his mistakes. You can stop before you exhaust yourself. You can find peace before you're forced into silence. The choice is yours. Walk if you must. But know why you're walking. And remember that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stand still. Some men change the world. Some men fight to keep the world from changing. And some men simply walk, one foot in front of the other, searching for something they can't name, until the day they run out of road. Napoleon walked with his army because he was searching for himself. He walked thousands of miles and never found what he was looking for. Because you can't find yourself by walking away from yourself. You find yourself by stopping, by turning inward, by facing the truth, That's the real answer to why Napoleon chose to walk with his army. Not strategy, not tactics, not leadership. Fear. The fear of being still. The fear of being alone. The fear of being enough as he was. He walked because he couldn't bear to stop. And in the end, the world made him stop. Forced him onto that island. Took away his army, his empire, his purpose. And without his motion, without his march, he faded. Not because he was weak, but because his entire existence had been built on running. And you can't run forever. Eventually, we all have to stop. The question is whether we choose to stop, or whether life stops us. Napoleon didn't choose. And that made all the difference. So tonight, as you close your eyes, remember this. Motion isn't always progress. Sometimes it's just avoidance. And the thing you're avoiding will still be there when you stop. Better to face it now, on your terms, than to run until you collapse. Napoleon knew this, I think. Deep down. But knowing and doing are different things. He knew he should stop. He knew he should face himself. But he never did. He just kept walking. Right into history. Right into legend. Right into oblivion. Don't let that be your legacy. Walk if you must, but walk towards something real. Something true. Something worth the journey. Not away from yourself, but toward the person you're meant to be. That's the lesson Napoleon never learned. But you can. You still have time. He ran out of time on a windswept island in the Atlantic. But you're here now, reading this, thinking about this. And that means you still have a choice. Choose wisely. Choose bravely. Choose to stop running and start living. Because in the end, that's all that matters. Not the empires you build or the battles you win. Just whether you had the courage to be yourself. Fully. Honestly. Without apology. Napoleon never had that courage. He had courage on the battlefield, courage in politics, courage in the face of overwhelming odds. But he didn't have the courage to be still. To be quiet. To be enough. You can be different. You can be braver than an emperor. Not by conquering the world, but by accepting yourself. That's the real victory. That's the real triumph. That's what it means to win the war against time. Napoleon lost that war. But you don't have to. The war was over, but victory had not yet arrived. It never did. For Napoleon. But maybe it will for you.